Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to focus on how British actions inspired the American Revolutionary War. This is your final video for this unit, so let's get started. First of all, on our way to independence, Great Britain's money mess. Between 1754 and 1763, the American colonies, Great Britain, France, and the Native American tribes living in the colonial region were involved in what we call the French and Indian War. Now, it's kind of a misnomer. It kind of sounds like something that it's not. The French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, was actually fought between France and the Indians and Great Britain and the colonies. So Great Britain and the colonies were fighting like on the same side against France and the Indian tribes. So anyway, this is called the 7 Years' War. It was actually fought on 3 different continents, but the part that we really focus on, obviously, is the part that influenced our history the most. So this was fought over land in Pennsylvania and Ohio, basically over territory where are the Indians allowed to be, where are the colonists allowed to be. It was a big mess. But anyway, the American colonies and Great Britain were victorious, and war, as we know, costs lots of money, lots and lots of money. So because of the cost of war, Great Britain decides to start taxing the American colonies. And this is something that you've heard about since you were very young. The Stamp Act and the Tea Act and the Sugar Acts and the Boston Tea Party, all of those different events eventually led to something called the Intolerable Acts, which eventually led to uniting for independence. But let's step back for a second. So how did the French and Indian War influence the American Revolution, or how did it directly impact the American Revolution? Well, in order to repay the debt, or in order to rebuild the British treasury that was bankrupt basically by the French and Indian War, King George III and Parliament decided that it would be a great idea to tax the American colonies. Now, there were 2 schools of thought on this. The colonists didn't really feel like they should be taxed by Great Britain because Great Britain fought a war on our continent. It didn't make much sense. Now, Great Britain felt that the colonists were, they wanted to be called British citizens. They wanted to be given the same rights as British citizens. So they just thought that it was something that the colonists should do. It was their responsibility as British citizens to pay those taxes to help rebuild the British treasury. Anyway, the Stamp Act placed a tax on pretty much all paper goods, and it wasn't a stamp like we think of it today that you put on a letter to mail it. It was like an embossed seal. So if you ever look at like your birth certificate, the seal of Missouri that's embossed in your birth certificate or wherever you were born, that's an example of something that you would have seen on a stamp paper. Okay? It's interesting to note, though, that the Stamp Act never fully took effect because the American colonists rebelled against it so much that the stamp collecting agents, the British government officials, were afraid to actually collect stamp tax money because they feared for their lives. Go America! Anyway, the Tea Act actually did not increase taxes on British tea, which is something that I think we get confused about. The Tea Act actually made British tea cheaper than the Dutch tea that the colonists were used to drinking. And to kind of put it in my words, let's say my favorite kind of coffee is donut shop coffee. Well, if you told me that I had to buy Folgers coffee, if you made the good donut shop coffee so expensive that I couldn't afford it, and the only thing I could afford was Folgers coffee because it was cheaper, I am not going to be very happy. That's kind of what happened with the Tea Act. The British tea, which didn't taste as good as the Dutch tea, was actually cheaper for the colonists to buy than the Dutch tea, which was better quality and it was higher. So the Tea Act made the British tea cheaper than the Dutch tea. We'll talk about that more. The Sugar Act, as you can tell, placed a tax on sugar-related products like rum and molasses and stuff like that. So in order to retaliate, in order to get back at Great Britain for the Tea Act, we know the colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians and dumped tea into Boston Harbor, known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, in retaliation to that, the Intolerable Acts were passed. Now, in the United States, or in the colonies at that time, these acts were called intolerable, meaning, oh my gosh, we can't stand them. In Great Britain, that same group of acts were referred to as the coercive acts. And that word coercive could mean like persuasive. We're going to try to persuade you to follow the rules and abide by the law. But we'll talk about the intolerable acts in class. So, moving on now. Attempts at unification. Attempts at unification started all the way back in the 1750s, and we don't really unite for independence until 1775, 1776. So, the first attempt at unification was something called the Albany Plan of Union. Put you on this page. All right, the Albany Plan of Union was drafted by Benjamin Franklin. And this was the first attempt at trying to unify the colonies. This plan was denied by the colonists in 1754 because they felt that it gave too much power to an assembly of representatives from the colonies. Now, this is kind of ironic to me because basically what the Albany Plan of Union was going to create was this representative assembly, okay, a group of people that were elected by citizens from a state. Okay, so you've got a group of elected representatives coming together to make laws for everybody. That to me sounds vaguely familiar. That sounds like our Congress today. So what our colonists were originally totally against is what we ended up with anyway, which I think is kind of funny. Anyway, jumping back over here to our slide. The First Continental Congress convened as a result of the Intolerable Acts. So because the Intolerable Acts were passed, we had a group of people that came together to say, okay, we've got to get something done. We've got to change something. We've got to convince King George III to treat us, to have a little more respect for us as colonies. So the big thing that came out of the First Continental Congress was that they passed an embargo. Embargo. That's a bold word, so I would definitely write this down. An embargo is a prohibition of trade. Prohibition of trade. So that basically means that we decided that we were not going to trade with Great Britain anymore. That was our way to try to get them to see that we were really serious, that we weren't going to pay these taxes, that we wanted to be treated like either an independent nation or British citizens, depending on who you talk to. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, which was fought April 19, 1775, is often called the first battle of the Revolutionary War. And it's kind of how historians mark the end of the First Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress, which took power going into the Revolutionary War, assumed the powers of the central government. So they attempted to print money, and they attempted to loan supplies to different groups. All those authorities, or all those responsibilities that we would normally associate with the central government. They even named John Hancock president. So you're often told that George Washington was not the first president of the United States. Well, neither was John Hancock, but because we weren't the United States yet. But anyway, John Hancock was named the president of the Second Continental Congress. Now I have here, was it legal? Was it legal for the Second Continental Congress to assume all these authorities, or all these powers and all these responsibilities? Take a second and think about that, and be ready to talk about that in class. So moving on then to the Declaration of Independence. In June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposed a resolution to Congress, the Second Continental Congress, indicating that the American colonies should be free, that we should be a free and independent nation. In July of 1776, the Richard Henry Lee's resolution was eventually accepted, and it was approved by Congress on July 4th, 1776, and we know that now as the Declaration of Independence. And I know you've spent a lot of time talking about the Declaration of Independence in other classes, so I'm really not going to go too far into it. But just know that there are three main parts of the Declaration. The first is the statement of purpose and basic human rights. I know you can't really see that behind that image there. The second is the list of grievances. And a grievance is basically a complaint that you have against someone. So this is probably the biggest part of the Declaration because it's where Thomas Jefferson and the other committee that was established to draft the Declaration, it's where they basically complain or list their complaints, everything that they think King George has done that was wrong. So it's kind of a big section. And then last but not least is the conclusion. And this is where our founding fathers say we are no longer tied to Great Britain. We are politically and economically and socially free. We are an independent nation. So that's pretty cool. So moving on then to our last essential question for this unit. We want to look at the Articles of Confederation. Now, I've alluded to this before as we've talked about different forms of government and the Constitution itself, but the Articles of Confederation was our first attempt at setting up a government in the new United States. Okay, we had the Mayflower Compact that was used to govern the Plymouth colony. We had the general orders and the fundamental orders of Connecticut and blah, 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 blah. We've had all of those different documents, but this was the first attempt at the framers of our government at setting up a government just for the United States. So think back for a second about those three systems of government that we talked about, the unitary, federal, and confederal system. A unitary system was one in which there was one central government and the regional governments didn't really have a whole lot of authority. A federal system was a division of governing power between a national government and a state government, or many state governments. And then the last one was a confederal system, and this was a system in which the states retain most governing power. So basically the federal government doesn't have a whole lot of authority. And that's what we created under the Articles of Confederation. So a couple of facts, a couple of things you should know. And we'll spend some time talking about this when we get to our Constitution unit as well. But the Articles of Confederation, it had a unicameral legislature. Now this is a word that you're most likely not familiar with, unicameral. Now, the prefix uni means one. Cameral means chamber or room. Probably didn't know that, but that's okay. So when we're talking about a unicameral legislature, we're talking about a single body that makes laws for a country. And we'll come back and talk about that in class. It had no federal court system. It didn't have an executive branch as we know it today. So it didn't really have the ability or authority to function as a strong central government. And what I have here for you, if I can get it to pull up, there we go. This is a handout that I normally give to the students about the Articles of Confederation. So I'm just going to breeze through this with you. You'll have this document in this video to reference. Some powers, weaknesses, and achievements. So some things that the federal government could do under the Articles of Confederation. They could make war and peace. They could enter into treaties. They could raise and equip a navy. They could maintain an army by requesting troops from the states. That's important, requesting troops. They couldn't really implement a draft like we had up until pretty much the 70s. They could request that states send troops, but if a state didn't want to, they didn't have to. They could fix standards of weights and measures. They could regulate Indian affairs. That doesn't seem like a big deal now, but then it was. They could establish post offices. Woohoo! And they could settle some state disputes by suggesting solutions. So if two states were arguing about land, something, the government under the Articles of Confederation could basically say, this is what we think you should do. And the states could choose to listen or not. Not really a good situation, a good solution for a federal government. The weaknesses of the Articles, and I could go on and on and on about this, but the weaknesses of the Articles. Obviously, it set up a very weak central government. They could not levy taxes, which led to a big problem that we'll get to next chapter. It could not regulate trade. It could not force a state to comply with laws. The federal government could not pass laws without 9 of the 13 states' approval. If they wanted to change or amend the Articles of Confederation, all of the states had to agree 100% on every change. And there was no executive branch, which meant that there was no clear leader for our country. So jumping back up here to this bullet, because it took so much approval to get anything amended with the Articles, it was never amended, not once, which eventually led to the new Constitution. All right, so some achievements of the Articles, good things that it did. It established, or it created the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. Also set up the Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which allowed the land that we got from the Revolutionary War to be divided up and to be surveyed and kind of groomed for statehood. And it also created the cabinet positions of Foreign Affairs, War, the Marines, and the Treasury. So it did do some things. So something to think about, and this is something we're gonna talk about in class. Why did our founding fathers create such a weak central government, and what were we trying to avoid by creating that confederation that obviously didn't work? All right, so we obviously needed a stronger government. There was boundary disputes between states. The border or the political boundary lines that divided up the states, states didn't agree that this specific boundary line separated their state from another, so that was a problem. We had a huge amount of war debt. We said earlier in this video that war costs a lot of money, and we didn't have any money as a government, so we went into debt, both foreign and domestic debt. We'll talk about that in class as well. Because of this ginormous war debt, we went into a depression, an economic depression. That eventually led to something called Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion is kind of fun to talk about. Basically, there's this guy, his name is Daniel Shays, and he was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. He was promised a pension, and a pension is like a retirement. He, along with all the other soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War, okay? So he's promised this pension from the government. The government is going to give him a retirement check. If the government can't tax, the government can't raise revenue. If the government can't raise revenue, they have no money to pay the soldiers. So if you're a soldier waiting on that pension check and you don't get your check, what are you going to do? How are you going to pay your house payment? How are you going to put food on the table for your family? You're not going to have the money to do that. So a lot of farms that these soldiers worked were taken back by the bank because these people couldn't pay their money, or they couldn't pay their bills. So Daniel Shays gets a whole lot of, basically farmers with pitchforks is a good way to describe them. They storm the Massachusetts state buildings. So like they break into courthouses, they interrupt court proceedings, they threaten to go to the National Arsenal, which was held in Springfield, Massachusetts. So the place where all of the weapons for the entire country were held. And at that time, a group of militia that were funded by rich people in Boston were sent to put down this rebellion. So when this happens, our founding fathers kind of go, oh, maybe we might want to make some changes. If a group of farmers with pitchforks can go and disrupt legal proceedings, maybe we might want to get something changed. So eventually, this leads to something called the Annapolis Convention. And at the Annapolis Convention, representatives from states got together to pretty much just talk about economic issues and if there were any changes that could be made to prevent another economic depression or to somehow, the goal was to somehow stabilize the economy. So with that, we're done. Please watch this and complete the accompanying activities. If you have any questions, let me know. Bye.